Hello, and welcome to Book Passages Conversations with Authors. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. We know you have a lot of options with author and book events, and we appreciate you selecting us, and especially for our regulars. I know you're out there, whether you're watching live or later in the recordings. We absolutely appreciate it. We do not take it for granted. And because of that, we always try to bring the best of the best. Tonight is no exception, with a very topical discussion. You can also participate in this discussion by putting comments and questions in the chat, and our authors will get to it probably a little closer to the end. But we promise we will check out your questions and comments. What exactly is critical race theory? CRT, we've been hearing that a lot lately. This concise and accessible exploration, the book that's featured, one of the featured books tonight, demystifies this crucial type of thinking, education for it, framework for understanding and fighting racial injustice in the United States. It's from renowned scholar, Dr. Victor Ray. On critical race theory, explains the centrality of race in America, history, and politics. He draws upon the radical thinking of giants like Ida B. Wells and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to clearly trace the foundations of critical race theory in the Black intellectual traditions of emancipation and the civil rights movement. Victor is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and his research has been funded by the Ford Foundation. As an active public scholar, his social and critical commentary has appeared in outlets such as the Washington Post, Newsweek, Harvard Business Review, and many more. Also joining us and featured tonight is Adam Serwer with his compelling collection of essays called "The Cruelty is the Point: Why Trump's America Endures." In it, he dissects the most devastating moments in recent memory to reveal deeply entrenched dynamics, patterns as old as the country itself. I probably don't need to list those. We're living it now, and they will go into it together. Adam is a staff writer for the Ideal section of The Atlantic, focusing on contemporary politics, often viewed through the lens of history. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including Salute to Excellence Award for commentary from the National Association of Black Journalists. With that, I'm going to turn it over to their very capable hands. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction, Paula.
So Victor, I wanted to start off by asking you, why did you decide to write a book about critical race theory, which I understand is the only racist idea in the history of the United States that has ever existed?
I think sort of the second part of your question alludes to why I chose to write this book at this sort of particular moment. As you know, in late 2020, President Trump signed an executive order banning critical race theory in the federal bureaucracy, sort of following up on conservative activist Christopher Rufo's demonizing of the topic. And, it's reported that President Trump saw him on Fox and then decided to go ahead and write the executive order. So the executive order actually came out as I was writing a lecture for my class entitled Critical Race Theory here at the University of Iowa. And for a moment, I was like, well, can I do this? What does this mean for my work and my teaching? And I decided, early on, I wrote sort of a quick explainer for the Washington Post. And in that explainer, I said, one of the things that was really frustrating to me about the way critical race theory was being presented was just the sort of sheer misinformation around what it was and what the goals were, right? So you had folks saying that it was like demonizing white children, making kids uncomfortable, that it was taught in elementary schools. And, the caricature was kind of unrecognizable to those of us who study this. So part of my goal was to just sort of clear the air and show that critical race theory was a useful explanatory body of scholarship that helps explain why racial inequality is so sort of intractable in US history.
One of the things you write in the book that I thought was really interesting is you say one of the many ideas attributed to critical race theory are in fact just plain honesty about America's longstanding structural racism. And I thought that was pretty fascinating because you see a lot of ideas that are not actually critical race theory, but it's just like Jim Crow existed and it was racist. And you can't really talk about that because, you know, that might make somebody feel bad about something white people did 60 years ago.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things that's frustrating, if you study this stuff at all, is, you know, looking at something like structural racism. So it's a concept that most folks probably aren't taught. I remember being taught early on in sort of elementary school and even the start of college, racism is about individuals being mean to each other. It's prejudice and stereotypes. And when individuals act on that, that's racism. And then, you know, I took some sociology classes. I took some classes at Vassar on critical race theory. And you start to learn that, like, yeah, that stuff matters. It's consequential. It makes a difference in people's lives. No one necessarily wants to be treated poorly. But I always say, you know, I'm not that worried if someone doesn't like me. I am worried if they don't like me and they pass a law meaning I can't work and feed my family. And so when we think about structural racism, it's the way that that animosity is sometimes built into laws and policies and practices that are much bigger than individual animosity and can actually end up compelling people who even don't have animus to participate in the system, right? And so if we think about something like segregated housing or segregated schooling, lots of folks participate in that system. They didn't create the system, yet they still benefit or suffer from, you know, differential access to education or exposure to toxins. Yeah,
I mean, I thought your you know, your explanation in the book is you know, quote, structural racism doesn't mean individual racism is inconsequential. It means individual racism is empowered by its incorporation into a system that can magnify its impact through biased patterns of resource allocation, which I think is pretty concise. But you often see people basically personalizing the concept. So structural racism is a way to say, this is how racism works, even if one person isn't like individually racist towards another person in an interaction. But you often see people personalizing it. And one of the examples of this is when the senator for my state, for the senator from Texas, John Cornyn, he was in a hearing and he asked the woman who's now an associate attorney general under the Biden administration, he asked her, do you believe that basically all Americans are racist? So he took this concept of, you know, how racism works through structures rather than individuals. And he said, so you're calling me racist? And sort of, it's interesting to me because it's sort of the opposite of what the concept itself is trying to explain. But I think a lot of people react that way. And I'm wondering why you think that is such a common response.
I think there could be a lot of reasons for that, right? One, in that particular instance, I think it's more to discredit the idea of structural racism as an explanation for what's happening in the political process than it is, you know, Senator Cornyn feeling personally affronted at being called racism by a description of sort of US policy, right? And so the reason that works, I think, or that it may work, is that one thing the civil rights movement was very effective at doing was discrediting sort of the most blatant manifestations of racial inequality or you know, the kind of bigoted racism that is represented by using racial slurs, right? And so I think that success, when Corin asks that question, he uses that real success of the civil rights movement against it to discredit the dismantling of structures that still create inequality today. And I think I would segue to a question for you with that, right? So I just argued that I think the civil rights movement was effective in discrediting sort of the most blatant kinds of bigoted expressions of racism. But I think about your book and the title of your book and the title of the essay. It was based on the cruelty is the point, and I think one of the things you point out there is that the Trump administration, and Trump in particular, was very effective at using cruelty and sort of a kind of open bigotry that we had been told was discredited to kind of bind people together. And so I wanted to hear a little bit from you about how that cruelty worked to bind people together. And then I'll try not to do double-barreled questions, but I also wondered, like, that phrase, the cruelty is the point, became kind of like a catchphrase for some of us over the course of the Trump administration. And I wondered what it felt like to write a phrase that became part of the zeitgeist.
So I think the part of why I think the phrase resonated is I do think it's an aspect of human nature, right? Cruelty can be a way of drawing a line around who who deserves to be respected and who deserves to be subject to violence or scorn. And I think that that's as clear as early as elementary school. You know what I mean? I don't know if we, if you are, when you're a kid and, sometimes there's a kid who's like a little different and he gets made fun of, and other kids, because they don't want to be made fun of, they want to be part of the group that's, on top, that's being made fun of, making fun of the kid, rather than part of the group that's being made fun of. They will participate in a sort of act of cruelty against this other kid who's separate from the group. And I think that is just, in Trumpism in a way is just that elevated to the level of politics. There's always, what cruelty does is it sort of justifies the line of separation between groups of people, because you can say this person deserves it or has it coming or is different from us and therefore it is virtuous to be cruel to them. And I think that is part of sort of one of Trump's insights was that this thing could be used to create community by attacking the people that conservatives were fixated on. They could bond together with each other by attacking outsiders. And I think, again, this happens in ways big and small in our lives every day. The distinction is that this is that kind of cruelty elevated to politics instead of, just individual interpersonal interaction. And I think a big part of that appeal was actually sort of the peeling off of that taboo that you discussed from the end of the civil rights movement about, public expressions of overt bigotry. I think there were a lot of people who found it very thrilling that Trump could say certain things about women, about immigrants, about Muslims, about Black people, and not seem to pay any consequences for it. And I think people really live, in a way, some people live vicariously through that expression, or through the expression of those things that seem to be going against the taboo that had been established by Black rights or immigrants' rights or women's rights movements. I think to the extent this succeeds at politics, I think it's important to remember that in 2016, in 2018, and in 2020, in none of those elections did a Republican Party run by Trump win a majority of the votes, not one single time. But it was able to take advantage of the ideal geographic distribution of the Trump coalition in order to win in 2016 and in order to almost win in 2020, despite the vast gap in the popular vote. So I think, despite the fact that it is unpopular, the counter-majoritarian institutions of American society, specifically the Senate, the Electoral College, things like this, there's a way in which they incentivize this kind of politics because the party that has the support of that coalition is encouraged to find new demons every day to say, these people are taking away something that you love and they're dangerous and they're going to destroy America as you know it. And we have to fight them. And that is, very powerful. And it's the reason why that kind of politics succeeds, because if our system was a little different, if you required a majority of the votes to win a presidential election, that politics would be a lot less effective. You would have to reach out more to constituencies that are not already part of the Republican base. And if you look at the Democratic base, it's not that liberals are inherently more virtuous than conservatives. It's really that the Democratic Party is made up of a coalition of people who are ethnically, religiously, economically diverse. And when you have to stitch together a coalition of, say, hipsters in Greenpoint and church grandmas in South Carolina, you necessarily have to make certain compromises. And those compromises are healthy for democracy working. On the other hand, if you have a coalition that is largely religiously, racially, culturally homogenous, it is much easier to exploit them through these sort of fear-based appeals, because you don't ever need to compromise with people who are different.
Okay. What about the second part of the question? Of how did it feel to write a phrase that became part of sort of like the national conversation, right? So like I read your essay when it first came out. I reread it here, and I remember at a certain point I saw folks. So at first I saw the phrase "the cruelty is the point," and it was like always attributed to you, right? And then at a certain point, like I just saw folks like using the phrase, and I was like, oh, Adam has made it for a while, but Adam like really made it, because like this, people just are using this phrase. They don't even necessarily know where it originated at this point, right? And so like I wondered how that felt, especially like for describing something that like it's clear you were like repulsed by, right? Or like worried about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little surreal to see something that you wrote reach escape velocity like that. Part of what I was trying to do with the book was I wanted to make clear that this is not like a Trump invention, that this is a kind of politics that, runs through American history. It runs through both parties. It is not exclusive to a particular ideology. You can go back to the early 20th century and find quite a few racist liberals. What I was trying to do with the book is broaden people's understanding of the phrase. So if it's going to be this phrase that gets used by lots and lots of people, I didn't want it to just be sort of an empty partisan jibe. I wanted it to have a certain amount of historical context and significance. And maybe that's sort of a pyrrhic it's not something you could do. That was my hope anyway. And now, you see people using it in ways that I might not approve of, or, some people kind of use it ironically. Some people try to troll me with it. It's not really mine anymore in that sense. It's its own thing. As far as personally how I'm concerned, I just didn't want it to be a thing where, like, have you seen that Simpsons meme where everybody they're in the classroom and everybody is turned around and they're like, say the line, and like I didn't want to do that. You know what I mean? Yeah. I didn't want it to turn into that. And that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, because I wanted people to broaden people's understanding about how this kind of politics of cruelty has manifested in American history, so that it is not simply an empty phrase that people use to simply attack people that they disagree with.
Okay. I think that's a good seg to the next question I had with you. And and that's like, you draw like really heavily on historians, specifically around like Reconstruction and I think the civil rights movement. And I've heard you say in other interviews, like what people have forgotten is also news. And so like, I wondered why you think it's so important to remind folks of this history. And then again, I said I wasn't going to do double-barreled questions, but here I go again. And then like the other part is, do you think like the bans that we're seeing around critical race theory in the 1619 Project are in part a response to like, you and a number of journalists of color sort of turning towards history to explain the current moment, right? So I can think of the 1619 Project or Jamel Bouie at the Times using history to talk about now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that politicians draw on a certain kind of historical memory to give legitimacy to their politics, and they do it so frequently that we almost sort of forget that we're doing it. But make America great again implies that there was a specific time in American history that you're talking about. And when Barack Obama says, the arc of history bends towards justice, well, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? The arc of what history? At what time did it, at what time have we achieved justice? Like there are sort of implied questions that never get asked because these phrases are so full of ideological content that their audiences already understand, that we don't really explore them. And I think, to your question, I do think that an examination of history that illuminates present injustices in a particular way, necessarily creates certain moral obligations. And so if you do not like the idea of having those moral obligations, you are going to try to discredit that reading of history. Now, I'm not going to say that, you're not allowed to criticize or disagree with anything in the 1619 Project or anything like that, or my work or anybody else. But I do think sort of in the broad, in broad strokes, we are arguing about how much of American inequality, particularly racial inequality, is the product of policy decisions and how much of it is the fault of the people who are being deprived of resources. And I think if you are someone who does not think that the government is responsible or should remedy those issues, or you think ideologically that an attempt to remedy those issues would be worse than the problem that currently exists, you are necessarily going to be drawn towards a version of history that minimizes the kind of discrimination that you and I talk about in our book. Okay. And so I do think, it is an argument about history, but it is also really an argument about the interpretation of history, which is not something that can necessarily be settled with historical fact. I mean, I do think that in some cases, if you look at you can criticize the 1619 Project all you like, but if you look at the 1776 Project, I think it is very clear that that has far less historical rigor than the thing that it's criticizing. And that's the case with a lot of this stuff because, there are some conservative readings of the founding fathers that say, yes, they were flawed, but here's why we should still respect and honor them. And there are some conservative readings of American history that insist on deifying particular figures as kind of faultless. To this day, I get hate mail for my piece about Robert E. Lee and his true views on slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction and its aftermath, because people learn a fictional version of who Robert E. Lee was. And they get mad when you tear that mask off that particularly cherished historical figure. And it's not even their fault that they learned that version of the story. Like I was taught that version of the story. But some people react in a hostile way to being told the truth about their own history because it reorients, it can threaten to reorient their own self-conception and their own politics. So I think, yes, there is a backlash to writers of color digging through history to explain current events. I think that's obvious, but I also think what we are really engaged in is an argument about interpreting history that places one kind of obligation or another on our present politics.
So I think this is a place where some of our work overlaps a bit in terms of, in my book, I talk about notions of racial progress and how critical race theory thinks of racial progress versus sort of the mainstream rendition, right? And how critical race theory, looks at the victories of post Reconstruction and the civil rights movement as real victories, but it places a greater stress on the long period of Jim Crow after redemption and sort of the pushback to the civil rights movement that I would say is like the era that we're still in, right? And I think that that is, you know, one of the reasons people are up in arms about critical race theory. But I also think that, as you said, like learning that history was jarring to me because, you know, before a certain age, I had this sort of like Black History Month PBS special version of what U.S. history or what racialized, what, you know, sort of racial progress in U.S. history. And it was jarring to learn that things were not as, things were not always getting better.
Yeah, I mean, I had I don't know, did you meet Derek Bell when he came to Vassar?
I did not.
Were you not there yet?
I was not there yet, but I did meet Derek Bell. We could talk about that in a minute, but go on.
Yeah, we can talk about, well, I met him briefly when he came to Vassar, you know, red faces at the bottom of the well, all that stuff. And you mentioned him in your book, and he's sort of a particularly pessimistic figure, as someone who sort of lived through lived through the changes that we're talking about, and also the backlash to the changes that we're talking about. And in the book, you know, in your book, you note that he believed that racism was an integral, permanent, and indestructible component of American life. And I guess, you know, I think that there is a really cynical interpretation of this that has been used by people who want to, you know, demagogue CRT. And I think there's a more good faith interpretation of this, which is that this is a man that has seen a lot and is entitled to his pessimism. But does that kind of outlook make progress difficult in the sense that people might lose hope if they come to see what they're fighting for as basically unachievable?
I think that's all right. So do I think folks paint Bell as pessimistic? Absolutely. And I think, you know, that might be, it might be warranted. I also think, you know, if you look at sort of 400 years of history on this continent, what's more realistic, that like racial utopia is around the corner, or that the kinds of racial inequality we see are going to continue, right? And so I don't think anyone would call Dr. King pessimistic, but, you know, and you've already quoted, I think maybe here, I know you quoted in the book, the quote about the arc of history bending towards justice, right? But Dr. King also in a letter from Birmingham jail says, you know, time isn't necessarily progressive, time is neutral.
Right.
And he fears, in line with Derek Bell's thinking, he fears that bad folks dedicated to racial inequality have used time better than folks dedicated to, you know, full inclusion. So I don't think Bell is pessimistic. I think he calls it racial realism. That's been sort of co-opted by folks who I don't really care for, that particular phrasing. But Bell called it racial realism. And he thought, and it's something that I think, that, you know, something Baldwin would say too, is like, he thought, look, if we're going to change this, if we're going to, you know, create more situations where there was, you know, periods of progress like Reconstruction and like the Civil Rights Movement, you have to face the problem squarely. You have to look sort of, you know, the cruelty in the eye and face it and figure out how to get the political coalitions and the political will to do it. And Bell said, ultimately that was hopeful, right? Ultimately the idea that you could win, or, you know, he said the struggle itself was ennobling in the face of odds that he thought were overwhelming. So yeah, I mean, I don't think
it's
that's
interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned King and Letter, because I think people quote King, but they don't read him.
Yes.
And I think, you know, we're talking about history, and I think people sometimes forget that the civil rights movement coincided with a rethinking of the Reconstruction era. So until for up until that time, the academic consensus was that Reconstruction was a mistake. Black men were not ready for the vote. Black people were inferior. The South was justified in creating a racial aristocracy. And there was a rethinking of this. And one of the people doing that rethinking was C. Vann Woodward. In his book, Strange Career of Jim Crow, King described it as the Bible of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And that was because he had shown that this was contingent on a lot of historical events, on labor relations, on, it was not something that was inevitable, but people did make a choice. And I think, King's view is more realistic than it's often portrayed, in part because what you're talking about is him being aware that you can make a different choice, but that people made a particular choice, and that's why the world is the way it is. That's why he is in the situation that he's in. That's why Black people were in the situation they were in during the civil rights movement. So I think, the other side of this hostility is that we know for a fact that these reimaginings of history or reinterpretations of history can have important political effects, even if, even for people who never, ever even heard of C. Vann Woodward or ever picked up The Strange Career of Jim Crow.
So I have been saying this, I've been doing a number of talks about this, and I've often got the question of what are white parents so afraid of, right? So we hear white parents are saying that kids who learn about, structural racism or the history of the civil rights movement in schools, they're going to feel bad that they're white, or they're going to feel bad about, they're going to feel targeted or stigmatized, or, just bad about their whiteness. And I have been replying, I actually don't think that that's what these parents are afraid of at all. What I think they're afraid of, if you have kids, kids are going to recognize that this is wrong. Kids have a really sort of overdeveloped sense of fairness, and kids know that racial oppression, racial inequality is not fair. I think today, we saw a bunch of high school kids walking out of schools in Virginia protesting these new anti-trans laws by Youngkin, who was, elected on this sort of anti-CRT wave. And that's actually what I think parents are afraid of, is kids reinterpreting a history that parents might be implicated in and finding it wanting, right? And again, if you've ever had a kid and your kid tells you, as they will, you are not living up to your morals or their morals, it can be painful, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be onto something with the idea that parents are afraid of being judged by their children. I think, I'm certainly not the first person to raise this, but I think when you look at the George Floyd protests and how many young people participated in that, I think that in itself can feel like a judgment. And I think that sense of that feeling of being judged can actually be a very potent motivator for a certain kind of reactionary politics. And I think that, that's in part why, the backlash to CRT in some ways has really focused on that. The language of that backlash has been well, we're the ones being judged by this thing that reduces us to some sort of racial essential, when obviously, as you write in your book, the point of the position that CRT takes on race is that it is a biological fiction. It's not real. It has social significance, but that's not the same thing.
Yeah, so I just want to expand on what you're saying there. It's not just incidental. Christopher Rufo, who I talked about earlier, who's been credited with sort of taking this moral panic mainstream, literally said he was worried about the backlash. He was worried about the Floyd protests. So I don't know if you remember, a bunch of books became bestsellers, like Kendi's book and a bunch of books around race and ethnicity became bestsellers. Rufo says he went and read those books, started tracing citations back to critical race theorists, and found that he decided critical race theory was the perfect weapon to sort of beat back what folks were calling the racial reckoning, right? So it wasn't incidental, that was the plan.
Mm-hmm. You write, sort of towards the end of the book, you write that, what started as a set of laws targeting critical race theory has metastasized into a series of broader nationalist attacks on who belongs in a multiracial democracy. Can you elaborate both on this idea and also what critical race theory has to say about it?
Yeah, so, we were talking a minute ago about Bell and pessimism, and Bell has this idea of, he's like, look, progress isn't automatic. When it does happen, it's through what he calls interest convergence, right? And that's the idea that, according to Bell, his progress for Black Americans has typically happened when there's like equal or greater benefit in a policy to white Americans. And so what critical race theory has to say about this, I think, is we've entered a period of what I think Bell would call interest divergence, right? So when I talk about this metastasizing into a broader set of nationalist attacks, I'm thinking about this in terms of what's happening around the globe and the rising nationalism that I think has created a space at home for the Trumpist right and the rising sort of authoritarianism we see in the US. And the reason I say that is Bell, when he described interest convergence, he used Brown v. Board, which seems counterintuitive, right? Because we think of Brown v. Board as a moral victory for white Americans. And he's like, look, yes, it was kind of a moral victory for white Americans, but it wasn't necessarily out of the goodness of their heart. He was like, this was a response to global pressure from communist regimes that were using propaganda about the US civil rights movement to get proxy states on their side. And so when I look at sort of like the global picture right now, that need to sort of save face with communist regimes is gone. And the US right is comparing itself to who? To Orban, to Putin, to Italy for the last couple of days that just elected like a leader who's directly tied to fascism. So that internal checks on the kind of persecution that you talk about in your book and that, critical race theory is fighting against have broken down in some ways. And I think it's emboldened the right to make these sort of broader nationalist attacks. And I'm a little, I'm worried about what that means in terms of movements to bring about a kind of convergence again that could damp down some of the international authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting because, the past, Europe has been presented as a kind of boogeyman, like we don't want to be like Europe. And now you see in American right, the American right is drawing from what is essentially, they call themselves nationalists, but what is essentially an international right-wing political movement, which is ironic because, during the Cold War, the accusation was that it was the leftists who were, in cahoots with these, foreign agents of a foreign ideology and trying to impose it on the United States. And you sort of have people arguing for political models that are literally foreign. But in some cases, I think, at least they're drawing on those. But I think, I don't know how you feel about this, but in some ways, I think they're drawing from, in doing so, they're almost trying to hide the American tradition of authoritarianism, which is always framed in this sort of as the protection of a kind of protection of democracy, but really what it is a protection of the ability of certain people to participate in democracy and to have their will made law or policy, and have the political rights of those who are not part of that polity excluded entirely from the process. And I think that's something you see with the way, the way these voting laws work, the way gerrymandering works, the way the Supreme Court has decided to completely sort of ignore all the explicit constitutional protections for the right to vote in order to essentially enable what is a Republican campaign to insulate conservative legislators, from their own constituencies.
Yeah, so I by no means mean to downplay sort of the homegrown tradition of like racial authoritarianism or racial
Oh,
fascism.
of course not. Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that. I
Yeah,
was saying, you know, there is this like European flirtation, but in a sense, I think they're really drawing from an American tradition that
yeah.
is an ugly one that they don't want to admit that they're drawing from.
I think that's it, right? I think I think you're right. I think the
Or
only thing
maybe even are unaware that they're drawing from.
that I would say is different is at least like, you know, there's a lot of race scholarship that talks about specifically like post World War II and revulsion at Nazism led to sort of the kinds of taboos that you and I were talking about earlier with sort of like, you know, explicit bigotry. And the Soviet Union used that very effectively. And what I'm saying is like that external check is gone. So folks don't even need to pretend anymore, right? But your point about it being homegrown is really taken. And I think before we go to maybe Q&A, I do want to ask you like at least one more question. I have a bunch more that I could ask, but and thinking about like sort of this, you know, this international angle that we were just talking about, I was reminded of like what you write in your book about like white supremacy as a kind of conspiracy theory. And I was thinking about how sort of like similar conspiracy theories are circulating, you know, in some of these other places where there's a rising nationalist movement. And I just wonder
I
if you
want to
had
be clear. White supremacy is not a conspiracy theory. It is a conspiracy.
a conspiracy. Okay, go ahead.
It is an actual conspiracy. I mean, you look at something like Tuskegee is a conspiracy. The efforts to disenfranchise Black men during redemption, those were conspiracies. The effort to like completely undermine Brown v. Board so that white kids didn't have to go to school with Black kids, it was conspiratorial. And we use that word conspiracy sometimes to mean made up or crazy. But I literally mean it in the sense of a group of elite people are using their power in order to make things bad for another group of people who have less power. And so it's, you know, there's a way, you know, I think, you know, because it is so conspiratorial, it can sound crazy. Right. I mean, I think if you are not, if you are hearing about America's racial history for the first time, I think it can sound, rather than like a conspiracy, it can sound like a conspiracy theory, right? That there were people, you know, that American immigration laws at the turn of the century were based on eugenic pseudoscience that the Nazis later drew on to justify their own agenda. That can sound like conspiracy theorizing. In fact, you can see that, you know, there's a documentary right now by Ken Burns about, you know, that deals with some of this. And you can see people, I've seen conservatives getting angry at Ken Burns raising this, which is a historical fact, but it sounds like a conspiracy theory if you know, if you're completely unfamiliar with that history, in part because of what you have wrote about in your book, which is a version of American history that is so sanitized that we do not get the parts, that people do not get the parts of it that would allow them to process that as a real possibility.
So I just want to say I agree with you, and I appreciate the clarification there. And I'll just end with this like quick story. I remember one time I had a student like come to my office, and this student like brought this book that was like conspiracy theory. And I was like, look, I was like, you don't need this, right? And I was like, here's how you sort of like find good sources. Here's how you find good information. And I was like, also, like, here's a copy of the New Jim Crow, because like the reality of this is, as you were saying, a conspiracy and like verifiable and much worse than anything that you're like fantasizing about over here, right? So yeah, I agree with you there. Do you want to open it up to?
Yeah, sure. Do we? I need to look at the. Sorry, 1 second.
So I think.
Okay. So I think we have one question that isn't the demonizing of CRT just part of the ongoing whitewashing of history? I'll leave that one for you.
Is it part of the ongoing whitewashing of history? So yeah, I mean, I think so. CRT draws on history, but like it arose in the law, and so like sort of the genealogy is clear, but also like a little muddled in that CRT drew on ideas that were existing in disciplines like history. Kimberly Crenshaw talks about like being an African American studies major, right? So like ideas from folks like Du Bois before she went to law school. So ideas from folks like Du Bois or the history of the civil rights movement make it into CRT. But CRT is sort of like methodology in the law and sort of a set of ideas for analyzing, a given set of facts. So on the one hand, yes, it's part of the whitewashing of history, but like CRT isn't necessarily like reducible to history. It's been adopted in a whole bunch of fields to more or less, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is related to what you were talking about, which is they really use CRT to mean, literally any unpleasant fact
Yeah.
about America is critical race theory, and therefore can be ignored or dismissed, and therefore you don't have to reevaluate your priors on the basis of newly gained knowledge.
Yeah, and I think so. I wrote a piece for Time in which I tie the strategy, what they're doing. I call it Critical Race Theories, Merchants of Doubt. I don't know if folks know that book, Merchants of Doubt, that was about how like right-wing think tanks intentionally muddied the waters around things like the dangers of smoking or climate change, right? And they paid scientists or pseudoscientists to say like there was more uncertainty than there was. And so I say that like this strategy is exactly what they've done with critical race theory. They put a whole bunch of things together. And again, back to Rufo, he worked for the Discovery Institute, which did this in the late 90s and early 2000s around evolutionary theory. I don't know if folks remember this controversy of like teach the controversy around evolutionary theory, right?
Around
Teach
intelligent design.
Around intelligent design, yeah. So Rufo worked for those folks before he did this, right? And so like he's so there's something, this is like a critique of the way the media has covered this for me, but there's something like incredibly disturbing to me that like this is literally like the Scopes monkey trial of CRT, right? Like you literally have folks who like honed their knives in anti-evolution battles, turning to race and now turning to, LGBTQ issues, and setting policy at the state level for education nationally, with a clear campaign of misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that because a few years ago, when I was working for MSNBC, I went to the Creationism Museum because the head of the Creation Museum was debating Bill Nye, the Science Guy. And I think that Bill Nye really thought that he was going there to debate facts, right? Like this is a guy who like his theory of the way the world works cannot survive the existence of radioactive dating.
Yeah.
And, and he just thought he was going to go there. And it was a circus. And like, he didn't, it's not that he wasn't correct, but he didn't win that debate in the way that you think of it, because debating is about performance, not facts. And so it was sort of, it's really interesting to think about that in that context, and that the whole museum is sort of a really extraordinary appeal to emotion. And it's like, there's like books in the children's section that are like, dragons are real. And it's like, well, if you're 10, do you want to live in the world where dragons are real, or do you want to live in the world where they're fake and they never existed? So we have another question, which is Alex asked, we just had banned books week, and I'm wondering if either of your books landed on any banned books lists. I do not think so. I'm not aware of it. I feel like someone would have told me and I would have like put it on Instagram or something like that. So the answer for me is no, but I don't know, Victor, have your books been banned yet?
My book has not been banned.
I just think, the whole book banning thing, it's extraordinary because they I remember hearing for years that, leftists on campus, it was a slippery slope. Their attacks on speech were going to lead to book banning. And then people started banning books, and like, it was like, okay, who cares? That's not a big deal. Let's talk about Oberlin on me.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
No. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing that I even wrote about in like 2017. And you probably, I don't know if you ever wrote about like free speech on campus, but like, you know, it was clear to me then how disingenuous the free speech, and not just me, like lots of people wrote about it, right? And I was like, this is a movement to shut down certain kinds of speech on campus. And like when these band, you know, I quit sharing the piece, but when these bans came about, like I started sharing the piece again. Like this is from 2017. Like this was so clear if you were just paying attention to what they were saying about what thought was unacceptable or how they felt about certain things being taught and what they wanted in its place.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I definitely met some, like, I did, you know, there are you know, there's the censorious leftist is a character, but it's also a person that exists. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But it's interesting because the existence of this person sort of served as a pretext for doing actual censorship.
Yeah.
Right. So the whole they want to censor us. Now we have to censor their dangerous ideas.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things that you know, is pretty familiar through American history. I mean, I think America, I mean, here's another example of Americans having a very rose-colored glasses view of their own history. I mean, if you go back to the debates over abolition, you know, the Southern states were literally banning, you know, abolitionist tracts. The Southern legislators were talking about, oh, you know, they say the meanest things about us in this stuff. They call us pirates of human flesh. And that's so rude. So we're entitled to ban, we're entitled to ban. I mean, like, you know, this sort of idea of America as a place that has always respected free speech is also, you know, also not true.
True. Yeah.
It's always been, you know, a struggle. Sorry, we should move on to the next question. What are we facing regarding the teaching of CRT or the arguments around it if the upcoming elections favor more conservative, and I think this says mega legislators. I think it means MAGA legislators. Otherwise, you know, we're talking about sort of like anime robot legislators, which I doubt they mean.
Okay, so what do I think we're facing? I mean, I think they've been super successful already in banning this. I don't remember the exact number of states that have had bans, but I also know that I think it's, I don't remember if it's UCLA or Stanford right now. There's another project that looking at these bans sort of on the local level, things like school boards and libraries. And the sort of, so there's Penn who's doing it nationally, and they've shown a ton of states. And then there's this project that's doing it more locally. And they've shown if you look locally, it's actually even more widespread. That a lot of sort of like blue states have, you know, no state is totally red or blue. There's always pockets of sort of the other party. And then in those places, a lot of conservative small towns have these kinds of bans. So, you know, I feel like if there's not pushback and significant pushback, folks get emboldened to go further. And so, yeah, I mean, I feel like if there's sort of like a red wave in the coming elections, folks are going to use this. And I'll say one, they're gonna continue to push. I'll say one thing. And you know, Adam, you talk about this in your book a lot, and sort of like the Democrats' unwillingness to mount a defense of their constituencies. And I'm not naive. Like I understand why they don't do this, but like it seems to be that like book banning and attacking teachers is like a winning issue and should be easy to sort of like craft some campaign ads around. And you know, folks like people who fight back a little bit. If you look, so you know, the polling on this is kind of mixed, because it depends on how you ask the question. But if you ask parents if they want their kids to learn like the real history of the US and about slavery, like most of them say yes. But if you want them to, if you ask them if they want their kids to learn CRT, they're like a little more non-committal because they've successfully like tarnished
Not
the
that they're
brand.
gonna learn it, but yes. I said not that they're actually learning that, but yes.
Not that they're actually learning that, but yes. And so I think, you know, if folks were like, these folks are attacking your teachers. They're defunding your public schools, and they're getting rid of like books on Dr. King and Rosa Parks. Like, I think that that might be effective. Again, I'm not a
So I
damn
think I'm not a political strategist either, but I would say that there's two things happening here. One, I think that nobody is so naive to think that in the age of the internet, their kids are going to the library to find, you know,
books on
to
Dr. King.
find
Yeah.
things they're not supposed to find. But I
Yeah.
think there's the reason that, the reason that this conversation has focused to a large degree, like when conservatives talk about it, they say we're trying to remove pornography from libraries.
Yeah.
This is not pornography. What they're trying to do is they're trying to reestablish a stigma, a kind of stigma that they no longer possess, because conservative ideas are no longer quite as dominant in the culture as they were when we were growing up.
Yeah.
Right. So we're not having congressional hearings on rap music and stuff like that anymore. So it is a different culture, but I think the book bans should not be primarily seen as sort of an attempt to really gatekeep knowledge, because I think they're not so naive to think that you can do it that way in the age of the internet. I think they're an attempt to reestablish a certain kind of stigma on things like LGBT rights, on racial progressivism, by sort of saying these are ideas that harm children, because when you say you're trying to protect children, that gives you a certain amount of license to act in ways that people might not otherwise accept.
Yeah.
And I think that's particularly true of censorship.
Excellent. Thank you two so much. I promised a topical discussion, and boy, did we get it. Adam, it sounds like you were a little ahead of your time. 2016, 2017, and you're just now getting the credit you deserve. And I hope with that voting, the Black Vote Matters, the book you were talking about, at least we're talking about in the green room. I don't know if you mentioned it here, but both of you, I feel, are definitely kind of ahead of the curve, ahead of the time. And thank you for bringing this vibrant and necessary conversation to Book Passage and our audiences. We really appreciate it. We need it. We can't get enough of it. Thank you so much. And thank you for mentioning about banned books and the importance and relevance there, on top of trying to squelch CRT and whitewashing history and things like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
For our audience, please keep in mind we have plenty of both their books, and they're behind me. And I believe we might have actual book plates, at least for Victor's book. So you can actually get a signed copy. So feel free to go to either store, San Francisco, Corte Madera, give us a call, place an order over the phone or online. We're happy to fulfill your calls. And before their books are banned, definitely get them in your hands. So thank you to our audience for showing up and spreading the word about this great discussion. Thank you to our authors, and we hope to see you again soon for another discussion, because this could have gone on for at least another hour for me. Thank you. And I know, sorry we did not get to all the questions and comments, but yeah, it's just the way it goes sometimes.
Oh, thank you so much
for having us.
Yep.
Thank you, Victor.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Thank you.